Hello everyone. I am so happy to have you here today. Thank you for joining us. We're so excited. This is our second Infused Insider live webinar, and these webinars are a place where we just want to go in depth on various monthly topics to keep you updated with what's changing in the industry, current challenges, and just what's coming next. So last month we discussed cybersecurity. It was a great webinar, and this month we decided that we wanted to dive into something that is very relevant currently, and that is modern work and collaboration. A lot of us know this, but in April of 2020, the world was thrown into chaos when COVID-19 emerged and organizations were forced to send workers home, and this brand new work paradigm began. And slowly, over the past 6 months, a lot of organizations have been offering various come back to work options for their employees. So today, our discussion is going to be centered around the new workplace and how to optimize collaboration and employee satisfaction as modern work has really shifted and molded over the last couple of years. So in this month's webinar, we are going to discuss in-depth collaboration in a hybrid environment. We're going to talk about best practices for managing modern work and Microsoft Teams governance and lifecycle management. We're also going to talk about better ways to manage employee engagement and satisfaction. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to leave room for some questions. And as we go through the webinar, if you have any questions, any follow-up questions to anything that we've talked about, feel free to add them in the chat and we will get to as many as we can. And I also want to let you know that this is being recorded, just so you know. But now to the fun part. I have a few of my lovely co-hosts and presenters who are going to be sharing with you today. Jeffrey Wilhelm, he is the Chief Executive Officer here at Infused Innovations. Phil Magnacheski, who is the Chief Innovation Officer here at Infused Innovations, and Brian Smith, who is our Senior Advisor here at Infused Innovations. How are you guys today?
Doing well.
Doing good. Awesome. Well, let's get started. So, Jeff, I'm going to have you kick us off on this very first section. So we're going to chat about collaboration in a hybrid environment. So can you talk to us about the changes of working in a physical office versus hybrid versus remote? Why do we even need to have virtual and hybrid workplaces to begin with? And what sort of tools and programs do organizations need in these type of workplaces?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. So we'll start off with that loaded question. I'm super happy to be here with you and Phil and Brian and everybody who's in attendance. So I love the topic of the webinar today because it's sort of a bit synonymous with the story of Infused. You know, a lot of businesses embraced we'll say hybrid work because of COVID, or in spite of COVID. In some cases, it's, you know, there is obviously, you know, varying degrees of acceptance, I think, across different industries and different size organizations. But I always like talking about this because it is a bit of, you know, the story of Infused, and something we've always, you know, been talking about since the beginning. So, you know, I love this infographic or this image that I threw up on screen. It's actually credit to Gartner, but I love it because it's a 2x2. You know, it just sort of shows the different modes of, or you know, the different methods of delivering hybrid work. And you know, before I dive into it, even though obviously it's somewhat self-explanatory, I will talk a little bit about Infused because, you know, we are fully virtual, fully remote workforce. You know, we have full-time staff and consultants, I think, across, I don't know, like 14 states or something like that. So there was a deliberate nature to selecting hardware and tools and molding a culture, something that you've done a great job sort of helping us with too, a culture that sort of enables the right mode of work when required, right? So the four modes of work that I love this this diagram showing, you know, talk about sort of, you know, is your work synchronous or asynchronous, and is your work distributed or co-located, right? And obviously working together is teams that are co-located, contributing to meetings in a shared space. Think about your traditional office environment where you might have a conference room that a bunch of people make a beeline to for a meeting, right? Then, of course, you have working together but apart, right? And this is something we do a lot here at Infuse. Teams are distributed, but we might have virtual meetings that we're participating in together. Then there's, of course, working alone together, which is one of my, which I think is an interesting way of working. Again, traditional sort of shared space, but people aren't in a conference room together. They might be at their desk collaborating, but collaborating in a non-way that forces them all to be in the same room. And then my favorite, because I'm an introvert, working alone and apart. Teams might be distributed like Infused, and individuals are conducting focus work and they're working sort of, asynchronously. I think the important thing here, and I talked about how Infused, we have staff all over the country. So we do, I guess I'll put it this way. There are instances where something, of course, is so critically important that people get on a plane and, get together and find each other. But I find that a lot of CEOs overestimate the amount of time required for synchronous work and definitely overestimate the value of co-located work. It's not to say it's not important, but I think they treat it as a legacy comfort. And you see that with this push to return to work, right? It's almost nostalgic a bit. And I would definitely recommend that people sort of step back, focus on taking an opportunity to realign their offices to the model of work that matters most for their staffs. Different verticals have different needs, of course, be cognizant of that. But maybe add more conference rooms or more huddle rooms, or find a way to use software and hardware, which I know Brian and Phil are going to talk about more too, to allow for better experiences and better integrations between on-site and off-site workers or completely off-site workers. Ask yourself whether having a physical office space is really as important as you think it is, or even required versus, a co-working space or other flexible shared working space, all those sorts of things. I touched for a minute ago on a lot of different terms. I mentioned co-working, I mentioned, flex work. There's also hot desking and shared desks. There's a whole lot of things we can talk about. I'm going to get to those terms in a second. But I think when we think about that previous slide, the enablement, the democratization of those four nodes, letting people be smart about selecting the mode that works for them and the moment that works for them, it's different for all different types of people. On our staff, we do something called the predictive index. And Stephen Webster, I don't know if he's on or not, but Stephen Webster, he talks about the predictive index all the time. And for anyone who's done like Myers-Briggs and things like that, it's a way of understanding how you work well with other people and how other people work well with you. It's not anything, I would say, revolutionary, but it gives you a real introspection about that sort of thing. And I would say apply that to work sort of broadly and ask yourself, like, how do I enable people to work in the way that works best for them? Be mindful of the balance between synchronous work and asynchronous work. Not everything needs to be an hour-long meeting. Sometimes a 15-minute meeting where everyone gets on the same page quickly, and then spend 45 minutes sort of, doing more focus time, in small groups or even just individual, staff delivery. But then enablement of those various modes that we talked about through flexible work, right? As we're talking about today, that could be work from home. It could be hot desking, hoteling, reverse hoteling, which I'll explain in a minute, flex space, co-working, all the things that I sort of talked about. So let me talk about each of those terms really quickly, just to level set, because I know they're going to come up again when other people talk more. Hot desking or shared desking is the practice of having an office, of allocating desks to workers when they're required. Could be a rotating system, rather than every employee having their own sort of fixed space within the office. Hoteling is very similar to that, but it's when you have a desk that you can assign in a provisional way at a short-term perspective to a temporary worker, it's sort of reserve a spot, right? And I think Brian will probably talk about that a little bit more later on, but we've been doing a project for around hoteling using Envoy, which integrates with Office 365 and Teams. Obviously, there's also the concept of workspace reservations natively in Teams. One of the things that's cool about Envoy, though, is that you can actually have health attestations attached to the workflow for hoteling. So you can sort of have some workflow built in there around, have I had a COVID test recently? Am I vaccinated? Things like that, which matter now, may not matter quite as much, a year or two from now. But being mindful of that stuff is always, I think, important. Reverse hoteling, I like to call the Airbnb model. Reverse hoteling is when you have a permanent desk that you can release when you're not using it for somebody else to actually use when you're not there. Again, sort of that Airbnb model of, rent a desk kind of thing. Flex space, on the other hand, it's a really general term. It could be used for flexible office. So a meeting room, a conference room, a huddle room, a shared space, a non-shared space, but it's allowing the workspace to mold itself to the users. Brainstorming sessions, one-on-one sessions, meetings. Some offices will put in place movable walls so you can have flexible space in that way. And then obviously co-working, and I look at the attendee list and I see at least one attendee who has, I know for a fact, a co-working space that they leverage. And those can be really great, not just because it's flexible, but because you get this sort of cross-pollination model of different people and different industries all sort of sharing a space at a given point in time, and it changes, day in and day out. Over the last 18 months, I fast forwarded there. During the last 18 months, we've seen some really interesting solutions from Microsoft, Logitech, and Red Thread, and Envoy, and so many other organizations trying to make it easier for companies to embrace this sort of a model. Last but not least, before I pass it back over, a little bit of facts and figures that I think sort of make this point really salient. First off, I titled this slide "Be Intentionally Hybrid" because there is a big difference between being accidentally or situationally hybrid. COVID sort of made a lot of people feel like they were hybrid because they had to be. A lot of companies obviously scrambled to make hybrid work. And now a lot of those same companies are sort of in this scramble to get everyone back into the office. But I would say for organizations that maybe embraced flexible work and saw the benefits of it, don't let that go away from you. Let your organization continue to embrace that. So let me talk about a few statistics really quick. There was a study, that same Gartner study that I mentioned in my first slide, where they did some surveys, pretty good surveys, to show how hybrid work can improve sort of team dynamics and productivity. The first one is that hybrid teams show greater agility. 70% of hybrid employees agreed that they adapted the structure of their meetings based on the intended outcomes versus only 49% of forced on-site employees. So there's this malleability factor, this agility factor that I think is exacerbated positively when you have purposefully hybrid teams. Similarly, you have hybrid teams showing greater, I would call it, psychological safety. So what do I mean by that? 66% of hybrid employees reported feeling more comfortable taking risks in their role compared to only 47% of their on-site counterparts. I think that's really interesting. And in a world where things are changing so quickly, that risk-taking, I think, should be a positive thing, a rewarded sort of thing. Then you've got hybrid teams showing greater intentionality. 67% of hybrid teams reported that their teammates accommodate their working preferences. 67% of hybrid employees agreed that their teams became more skilled at working asynchronously compared to only 56% of their on-site employees, which I think is amazing because it shows the value of intentional hybrid work, not just accidental hybrid work. And then last but not least, equity, right? When we talk about equity in the workplace, I think this is huge. 69% of hybrid employees reported that their teammates accommodate their working preferences more compared to only 54% of on-site employees. So folks that are situationally hybrid are more accommodating of flexible work, which means hiring employees in the right places for the right jobs, not necessarily because of a physical tie, or hiring employees that believe in equity more just because they're being valued for being hybrid. And I think that's really important because if you ask yourself as an organization, what do we value? Do we value time in a seat or hours in an office? Or do we value things like work product or positive outcomes or customer satisfaction, right? If you value those things and you measure those things, you start thinking about hybrid work and intentionality of hybrid work a lot more differently. So anyway, I know that was a long-winded answer to your question, Melissa, so I'll throw it back to you. I don't know if Phil or Brian have anything they want to add, but I know you have a question for Brian next.
Well, before I hop into my question for Brian, Phil or Brian, do you have anything to add to that, or do you think Jeff just sort of hit all the points there?
No, I definitely, the one thing I will say is with reverse hoteling, I need to figure out how to monetize that myself personally, even though I'm remote, so I don't know how that would work. No, it's exactly right. Like I'm hoping that a lot of these organizations, having been thrusted into the unintentional hybrid situation, since it's taken so long to get to this, we've been in this situation so long, hopefully many of them are starting to look at this more as the intentionality of it, and that shift towards it, especially with our labor market the way it is. I mean, the labor market is so tight, it's beyond tight, that employees have tremendous say and tremendous strength in organizations. I mean, just look at all the unions, for example, striking because they suddenly realize they have more power. So I think organizations need to make conscious efforts to really look at this intentionality.
Yeah, definitely. And Brian, go ahead, Phil.
No, I was going to say, just to pick up on that point, I work with, folks who are in the millennial age group, and then I have younger children that are coming up, some in college as well. And the fact of the matter is this, is that there's an expectation with the folks that are just entering or have entered the workforce and those coming up into the workforce, that this is commonplace. This is the way they expect to work. And to Brian's point, in terms of how tight the labor market is right now, if you want to be competitive and have the best folks on staff and be able to hire from wherever you want, you have to have this infrastructure in place to support that. Because the fact of the matter is, if I'm good at what I do, and there's an organization that requires me to commute from New Hampshire into Boston every morning, and I have to deal with traffic in and out, and there's one where I can work from home. If I want to go to a meeting and off hours and stuff, I can do that. I'm going to pick, most of the time, the one that's going to offer me more flexibility. So I think that organizations and leadership needs to recognize that, internalize that, and understand what that's going to mean for their business.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of workers are really valuing that flexibility. And I know I've talked about this a lot as well on some of the podcasts, but even for me, being able to, as a single parent, I'm able to drop my son off at school. I can start work before I drop him off. I can pick him up. I can run and grab coffee with a friend if needed. But, I have that flexibility to get work done. And that's great for me. It improves the quality and well-being of our lives, our personal lives. So Brian, one of the biggest things that a lot of organizations often talk about is the task of onboarding their entire team to a fully remote or hybrid model. It's not an easy task. And I know that it can take some learning best practices and tips and tricks for that new virtual office of yours. So, for example, something that executives often ask is about the accessibility of information in teams. Are all employees able to see the same information or play a part in the same projects or in projects they aren't involved in? Talk to us more about what that looks like, and talk to us about Microsoft Teams governance and lifecycle management and how that works, and maybe some best practices.
Yeah, I think from a hybrid standpoint, there's really there's many sections to cover. Some Jeff has already covered too, but there's two sections that I like to hover over, which is the use of the tool, and then the use of the other tools that are available to bridge this divide between in-person and remote. So let's talk about the use of the tool first. I mean, when all these organizations got thrust into the pandemic, thrust into the unintentional hybrid, or even organizations that just launched Teams outside of that, many of them didn't have any governance on in the very beginning. So it became a little bit more like the Wild Wild West. And then there was all this sprawl, and that causes issues with kind of like the questions that you were talking about, where do I go to find something, or how do I, as a CEO, how do I know my employees can find something? And I was trying to think of a fun analogy for this, and the analogy that I came up with was with how bad sprawl can be. In a team's environment where you just let everybody create a team. There's no governance, there's no rules surrounding it, there's no naming rules, there's nothing around it. It's like take a 7 or 8-year-old, and you don't want your 7 or 8-year-old going to the bus stop and having 30 buses there that they have to figure out which bus to take to get them to the right school. I mean, they're just either going to cry, they're going to turn around and come home, or they're going to get on the wrong bus, because they always got a 130 shot of getting on the right bus, and they're going to be confused because the 7 or 8-year-old sitting in calculus class rather than in an appropriate class. I mean, that's kind of an extreme example, but that's
Love it, Brian.
it's kind of what happens when you have no control, and Teams is such a critical tool for hybrid models to work. That you really need to throw some governance around that. And governance is not just tools, but it's also processes. So let's kind of dive into what that means. So a couple things. One, first thing I would say is lock it down. Restrict who can create teams and put a request and approval process in place to start. That way, there's intentionality behind I want this team. You have to think, you have to justify it, you have to give it a name, and a person then has to look at this, an admin of some sort has to look at this and say, yep, this makes sense, or no, let me tweak the name, or oh, by the way, did you know we actually have 3 other teams that are like this that we're trying to consolidate? So really lock down that team creation and put that request and approval process in place. Another thing too is look at the kinds of teams that you have. So often when I'm talking to different companies, we say like, okay, what are you trying to do? Well, usually from a team's perspective, you're like, okay, well, we have projects, okay? And you have large projects and small projects, okay? Sometimes you have events like webinars, or maybe you have an annual conference that you sponsor, or you have multiple events throughout the year. You have departments. You have executive teams or management teams that need to work together. You have what I like to call the working groups, kind of like the ad hocs, where it's not a project, it's not an event, but it's a group of just people from multiple departments that are coming together. So one of the ways that can help with that request and approval process is throwing a whole bunch of templates behind that. Like set up a template for here's what a project team looks like. And you can templatize it to the point where you say, okay, these are the channels that we typically have under a team. These for different discussion points that we have. These are the templates for documents like, say, a project charter or a RACI spreadsheet to identify roles and responsibilities. Even a planner board, you can preset planner boards or Microsoft lists that are filled out with all the information that someone would need to get this started. So right off the bat, you're encouraging use of the team and the tool by pre-populating with a whole bunch of information that's relevant right off the bat. To get all that to also work, if you're a larger organization and you have lots of teams, it really helps to have a good naming convention. You don't want teams that say test, demo, Kathy's team or Mike's team. That's not helpful. So not only purposeful on your naming of teams, but also standardization, like all projects begin with PRJ, for example, or a project hyphen. Internally, we actually use this at Infused. A good example is we have a template for a client team. And the client team is where we interact with our clients. So our naming convention for a client team is client hyphen, the name of the client. And then in parentheses at the end, we put EXT, which means there are guests that are in this team. So everybody in the organization immediately knows this team has guests. It's good for multiple reasons, so you don't say the wrong thing in the channel, in the team, but also from a security standpoint, someone as an admin who might not know all these particular teams can look at this list and instantly know, oh, there's guests in this. And when we're trying to do audits, it's just another quicker tool to be able to find all the little holes that might be in your security that you just want to keep an eye on. So naming conventions to me are really important. Once all that's done, then you have the life cycle of a team. We've created the team, it's in use. Teams aren't permanent. Teams are designed to be collaborative workspaces. They're transient. A project has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So you need to have a process in place that says, okay, at the end of this project, after X number of days of inactivity, or if this team only is supposed to be a 6-month team, at the end of that, you should prompt the owners of the team to say, hey, do you still need this team? If not, we're going to archive it, and we're going to move it around. There's multiple ways to archive with this, all these things that I'm saying right here: the request and approval process, the templates, naming conventions, and lifecycle. There's some good tools out there that can do this, and one of them is like Orchestrate is a tool that we've been focusing on lately. Fantastic company. They really understand the needs. And it gives you amazing tools. Lifecycle management is a great example. You can run all these reports that show the length of inactivity, how long it's been since the last post has occurred, how long it has been since the last file has been edited in some way, and can then automate things in the background. Because the other part of this too is this should be as automated as possible. The less human interaction that's required to maintain this, the better. And then you only bring the people in when decisions need to be made. An approval of a team, an approval of an archival process for a lifecycle management, for example. Just let the system do the work and let the system tell you when it's supposed to happen. Two other things that are important, and I'm looking at these more as a process side of governance, is for everybody that's familiar with teams. Every time you create a team, you get a general channel, and everybody's I always get questions about, can we get rid of the general channel, or can we do something else with the general channel? At the moment, no. Every team gets a general channel, and it's probably going to be that way for the foreseeable future, just because of the technicalities of how a team is built. However, you really should look at that general channel as maybe announcements or information only. And let me show you an example of why. A lot of times, there are times when a team is a very small team, and you can probably get away with just the general channel. But we all know that we create teams, and sometimes we need a couple extra channels in there for different topics that are related to this. If it's a project or event, let's go with an event for an example. If it's an event, it's a major event, it's your annual conference. You might have a channel for discussing the venue. You might have a channel for discussing guest speakers, and you might have another channel that's discussing the COVID protocols, for example, since we're in that right now. So you're isolating those discussions, those posts in different channels, because it makes it easy to find the information. If you just use the general channel as, hey, everybody just post some stuff in the general channel, you've now made the wild, wild west again. And now it's hard, you're having conversations about different things that are kind of spread out in this general channel. And it might work in the very beginning, but then you're like, oh, you know what? Now we need a couple extra channels. Well, all those posts are now in the general channel, so you're not really going to get them out and into the right channel for them to be in. So you just got to live with that. So I always like to say, try to not have teams that only have a general channel. Use the general channel really for announcements. And there's even functionality in Teams to make a type of post in a channel that is an announcement post. It's a different type of post, and you can actually control whether someone can respond to that. It can be a here's the information, no one can comment on it. So lots of really be aware of the structure of the channels. It to me is really important. The other thing, which I think is probably one of the most important things in being successful at this, is cultivating champions. You want to have champions in your organization that are, they may be super users, they may be well-respected people within the organization, they're very knowledgeable, they're very vocal. They're the ones that can help you push the agenda of, this is how we want to use Teams. This is how we're encouraging people to use Teams. We really need this to work for everybody. It can't just come completely dictatorial from IT or the executive team. It has to, you have to have some grassroots components to that, and that's the champions component that really can assist with that. So now that we've talked all about governance, now let's talk about the other side of this. Is how do we get this? How do we build this bridge between both the in-house and the in-office and the work from home staff?
And Brian, before you hop into it, we had a question from Jeff, and it's very specific to what you were talking about. So I figured maybe we could answer it now.
Sure.
He said, do you suggest using private channels within the team for internal collaboration, or if guests are a part of a team, or create a separate team for internal use only?
Private channels is such a great question. There are a lot of conflicting views, shall we say, on best practices for the use of private channels. They are a different beast. They have more limitations in Teams. So what I would say is this. The thing with best practices is, which I really find interesting with Teams as opposed to some other things, like best practices in Windows pretty much apply, like a security best practice, pretty much applies across the board. There's no ambiguity, there's no differences. You just like everything, you should completely have an antivirus solution installed on all your systems. Done. With Teams, it's a little different. And because, for example, private teams or private channels has some limitations. An example of a limitation might be creating planner boards in a private team doesn't really work. You have to create a planner board kind of outside of the private channel. Sorry, I said private team, private channel, and then put it in the private channel as an extra tab. It just doesn't allow it to work. So there are times when I think private channels are very useful. Especially if you have a team with a mixed grouping and you do still want to contain that information in the team, but you want to isolate and control who has access to it. So I think what you need to think about is who needs to be in this private channel, who needs to be having these conversations, and are the limitations of the private channel still okay for that? And still will help you maintain that. I know we've had some discussions internally about this too. So I know Jeff has thoughts on that every once in a while, because Jeff has thoughts on lots of things, which is fantastic.
I'll take that.
Jeff,
I'll take that. I'll take that in a good way. So I do have a comment on the usage of private channels as they relate to sort of a team that may have external guest users in it, where the internal conversation might be happening in a private channel where you don't want the external people to have. And I don't love having internal only private channels in a team that have external users, because if you think about good governance and lifecycle management, the lifecycle around a team that has external users might be completely different than the governance around a channel that has private internal only conversation. The durability, the longevity, and certainly from a naming convention perspective, you're sort of mixing those two worlds. Brian gave a really good example of, well, if it's an external guest in the team, we have, client dash customer name parentheses ext. Well, now we're talking about having an internal only conversation inside of a team that is purpose-built, let's say, for external client communication. So I find that mixes the two sort of modalities because they have different requirements around lifecycle management. So my preference is keeping the naming conventions associated with the lifecycle and associated with the usage of the team, which would mean likely that you would have those internal only conversations happening outside of that team. That's just my personal preference, but it makes things a little bit easier for me to get my head around. So,
right now, and even to your point, to take it even a step further, how many of us on this call have posted in the wrong channel before?
Never happens, Brian. Never happens.
So have that private channel right next to all the public channels, the standard channels, as they're called, that the guest has access to. You have an easy shot at accidentally posting to the wrong channel. One thing I actually didn't mention with naming conventions, I think that's also important too, that we use to hit on this a little bit more, is teams can have icons. It's that little box, the colored box you see with the initials. That's actually an image that you can set, that a lot of people don't know you can actually do that. We have a image that we've kind of standardized on. It's not the greatest image, but it's like two arrows going like this. It's very obvious when you see this image. And that image shows that this is one of those teams that has external users in it. Why that is good is because you might take a team that has a couple channels in it, and you might pin one or two of those channels. When you're in your pinned list, it's so hard to tell what team that's in just by the name of the channel. Sometimes you have that little subline underneath it that says what the channel or the team name is. By using the icon, you have an instant recognition that this is, oh, let me make sure this is a client channel. So very good.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, did you have something else, Brian? Yep. I think for time, if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I was just gonna blaze through this screen because this is the easy one to talk about. Okay. Basically, we're talking about removing the physical hurdles. When you go hybrid, you want to remove any physicalities that you can. One of them is a physical whiteboard. There are so many tools now in 365 that can assist with that. Planner, we've already talked about. Microsoft Lists, the whiteboard app itself can do that. So by leading by example and having your champions and your managers use these tools and push these tools and train to the advantages of using these tools. Like when you're in Planner and you have a task assigned to you, it shows up in your to-do list. So if you're on multiple Planner boards, you see all the to-dos you have across the gamut. Is really important. So that's one physicality to remove. Another physicality is the, I'm going to skip down one extra bullet here, is paper workflows. Like, what paper workflows do you have, and can you that have approval processes? And can you just use approval processes in Teams to try to eliminate some of that paper between the approval process, the approval tool in Teams, Power Apps and flows, and third-party tools that get added with like DocuSign and things? You can eliminate a lot of the physicality that happens with your users. Every meeting, this is one that I think should absolutely happen. Every meeting should be digitally enabled, meaning every meeting is a Teams meeting, even the in-person ones. You never know when you're in a hybrid environment. Yes, you might have a schedule. I'm in this office this day, I'm in the office that day, but things change. So you never know. And by making every single meeting enabled, you're done. Anybody can join from anywhere. They can even join from their office if they don't want to go down to the huddle room for whatever reason. And speaking of that transition, the huddle rooms, I think, are incredibly important. Pre-pandemic, they had started, it was more a Silicon Valley thing, I would say. But most companies just had giant conference rooms. You had the large conference room and you had like the medium or small size conference room. Now I think it's important to have smaller huddle rooms that are like office size, that are like for 3 or 4 people, that are Teams enabled. There's a display on the wall, there's a camera, and that allows that close working. It's a lot different feeling than being in a conference room where you have like a 25-foot, 30-foot conference table, boardroom table sitting there, and people are sitting really far away from the camera. It brings everything close, so it allows in-house people and working from home staff to just be closer together, and allows some place for people who work maybe in a cube farm to go to also do work in quiet or get on a call so they're not making noise in the farm. So remove that.
Yeah, Brian, what's really interesting about that, and I know that all the major vendors, Cisco's doing it, and Zoom and Microsoft as well in particular, is that there has historically been this feeling like of connectiveness of folks that are in the room versus folks who are joining by video. And I know that these organizations, and again, Teams is one of these places where they're looking to do this, where they're trying to make equity of visual and connectedness. So when you look at someone, it's like you're sitting across the table from them. So there are enhancements that are being made to make it feel that even though you're remote, right, whether someone's in the office or outside the office, that the feeling, the ambiance is very similar to everyone being in the same room. So you'll definitely see additional enhancements, I think, coming along on that front too, which will make that a little easier to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, just within the last 18 months, what has happened due to the pandemic and the acceleration that a lot of these companies have gone through, it's been tremendous, the amount of interesting features to, like you said, make that more intimate.
Well, yeah, and I think what it does is it just gives that humanity back. I think humanity is that personal touch and intimacy that's been sort of taken away from that physical in-person work atmosphere. We get a little bit of that back with those tools and technologies. And Phil, this is somewhat kind of tied to the question that I had wanted to ask you. So, a lot of this is great for the employee and the organization, but it can feel really easy to get lost in work. There's blurred lines sometimes between the office and the personal life. And a lot of that spontaneity of work and casual engagement is a lot more challenging in the hybrid or virtual workplace. And a lot of businesses are seeing that employees are leaving because their priorities have changed. And I want to discuss how we can better manage employee engagement and satisfaction, especially in this hybrid virtual workplace. So Phil, how can an organization or executives not just use this technology to enhance collaboration and work in that online environment, but also to help empower their employees?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. This is a big, and could be one of the biggest issues that organizations are having to deal with. And we've all felt it. I know our team included, is when we got into the whole, March, April of 2020, it was so easy. And we all did it, because we're all at our desks sitting at home, and you know what? It's 5 o'clock. I'll grab a quick bite to eat, but I'm just gonna go back and check a couple pieces of email and maybe do a couple things, and before you know it, it's 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And it's just so easy to do. And it's the challenge of trying to lower the risk of burnout is really huge for organizations right now. And part of the problem is that with the hybrid work environment, it's easy to get sucked into it, right? To be, it's, I'm just going to respond quickly to a chat or just do something really quick. So there's a couple of things that you really want to be considerate of. Is technology aside, I think organizations and employees need to kind of take a step back, take a look at what this new landscape entails, and be thoughtful about how we're going to engage in work. What expectations as leaders do we want to let, kind of portray to our employees? Do we want and say, hey, look, we're not going to do meetings on Fridays. That's going to be a company policy so people can catch up and get work done, right? Because we all know that we're on back-to-back meetings a lot of times, and it's, you get this task list that comes out of this stuff, but there's no time to do the tasks, right? So there's some thoughtfulness and rethinking of what hybrid work is going to mean, and how do I engage in that as an employee and an employer, part of it. But the other part of it too is how do you track these things, right? It's one thing to say it, but how do we track, and like, how do I as an employee understand that, I had back-to-back meetings for the last 30 days and it's just not conducive to getting, real work done? Or how do I know that, I didn't take a break through the entire course of the day, and I really should just give myself a chance to kind of reset, re-energize, clear my mind, that kind of thing. So I'll talk a little about Microsoft Viva, which is a product that Microsoft, I think the whole suite just became generally available recently. But this is a way, and it's all drawn from information that's collected in the platform inherently. But it allows me to understand, what does my schedule look like? Do I have downtime? Who am I collaborating with? Like if I'm let's say employees that are reporting to me, am I spending enough one-on-one time with those people to help grow and mentor and make sure that they're on the right track and getting what they need from me as well? And using those tools in there it empowers me as an employee to say, hey, look, you know what? I can click a button and schedule some focus time. I can click a button and schedule some time to meditate. I can do what's called now a virtual commute, right? I can actually schedule time to decompress at the end of the day, right? Especially if I'm just working from home, before I leave my office at home, I can do that, leave work kind of where it sits, and I can go enjoy my family and do whatever other things I'm doing outside of that as well. Jeff, I don't know if you can kind of advance the slide there for a second. There we go. But, Viva is an employee experience platform. There are other ones out there. Again, this one is really neat for a lot of organizations that are already on the Microsoft platform. The ability to use a lot of different pieces of analytics and insight in here. It allows me to share organizational goals. What's our purpose? What's our alignment? Again, trying to get that out to the entire organization. Culture and events. The other neat thing is, they talk about learning, right, as part of an organization. We're all being introduced to new technologies, and I think Jeff Snyder had asked the question about, how do I embrace the hybrid mode and without being a technical person? But we're thrusting a lot of technologies onto employees, which some are going to be really good at getting. Some are going to, go kicking and screaming, and then you're going to have the folks that are kind of in the middle as well. But the whole concept of inflow learning, so the ability to, to learn in the middle of something, to quickly be able to go and, get a 2-minute video on how to use Excel macros, right? To go out and do, hey, I want a quick refresher on how to. I got a meeting coming up with Melissa, and I want to make sure I'm mentoring her right. So I want to maybe watch a 5 or 10 minute video on best practices on mentoring, right? But having that in a platform like Viva, right? So I don't have to go out anywhere. I'm connected to it. It's easily accessible. I can go out and gather that information in real time. Is a huge opportunity for employees to get up to speed on technology, but also to engage and get ready for collaboration with other folks in the organization as well. And then the last one I'll touch on too is like the well-being piece. I can't overemphasize how important it is to schedule time within the course of a day to take a break. Within the Viva platform, they have I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Headspace application for meditation. So that's in there too. You can schedule 5-10 minutes in there and just, again, clear your mind. But I think generally speaking, again, the idea behind understanding how you're working and then be able to make those modifications so that you don't burn out and are a better employee or easier to collaborate with are going to be big issues that need to be addressed within organizations as well.
Yeah, Stephen and I actually just addressed this on our last podcast about the importance of not getting burnt out by making sure that you have that space and that time to take care of yourself, your mental health. It's so important. And I think with a workplace like this, we're able to do that, So thank you, Jeff, Phil, Brian, for sharing all of your insights. It looks like we have about 10 minutes left. So I have a couple questions that we had gotten that maybe we can address before we close this out. So looks like we already kind of answered Jeff's question about suggestions for helping non-tech savvy users adjust to these new modes of hybrid work. Does anyone else want to address that question further, or do we have any other comments on that?
I would say that the helpful angle there still is, I think the champions angle is a very helpful angle. Getting training from IT is one thing. Getting training from a coworker is a different experience for some people. It's just like a mental headspace thing of where you are when IT's over your shoulder saying you need to do this. Or like you get a little frazzled from back in my own help desk days versus the coworker saying, "Hey, just click this, click this." I think that champions really, my experience with having it in environments where we have had champions or subject matter experts that are outside of your IT department is really helpful. And also it's very helpful, to be quite honest, for IT too, because it not only does it take load off, but also it's a feedback loop that IT can get with a trusted partner that they hear things from that they can then execute on.
Yeah, and I think taking the time with your team to do weekly meetings or bi-monthly meetings or however often you feel that they need it, to be able to sit down and be like, hey, what are we struggling with? And then maybe, putting all of your heads together and figuring out, well, hey, there's this tool for this, or this tip or hack for this. Okay, so I guess I'll move on to another question. How can hybrid and virtual work affect industry clusters like Silicon Valley? Why will or won't hybrid and virtual work continue into the distant future? So why will or why won't it?
I think it will. I hope that besides the statistics, there's a lot of good reasons for organizations to want to embrace it. I do think there's an element of Silicon Valley valuing its community, right? Where if you're in Silicon Valley, you're part of an elite club, and if you're outside of Silicon Valley, you're just, somebody doing some work somewhere. But given external pressures and forces, or market forces, economic directives and mandates, housing situations, there's a lot that's been talked about in those. From a societal perspective, having employees that are a wider range of diversity, socioeconomic background, physical location, it's good for any workforce. There's years and years of studies about how having a more heterogeneous workforce is a positive. Homogeneity becomes an echo chamber. And I think there's some of that in Silicon Valley. So I think that it will, hybrid work will continue, hopefully, to remove some of the boundaries that I think exist around some of those clusters, as you mentioned.
In conjunction with that, too, I would say that I think it's probably naive to think that all of the best talent and resources reside in Silicon Valley, right? Just using it as an example, the fact that, even an organization like ours, right, we can tap into the best resources in the world, nationally or globally, if need be, and be able to offer a place to work regardless of where somebody sits. That freedom, that agility and adaptability is a huge advantage for an organization.
I also think that, if you look at just look at the CFO's checkbook, shall we say, the move to a hybrid environment means you need to spend less on real estate. That's a huge chunk of a lot of companies, expense is how much office space they have. And if you need less of it, that's a reason why I think hybrid is proving its point over the past 18 months that everybody's been forced to it. And we have clients who are looking at, what do I do with the space that I have?
If you've got office space in Miami and Atlanta, New York City, Boston, right? And you can downsize it by 50%, right? Or downsize it by 75% by saying, instead of an entire cube farm, I've got a couple huddle rooms. It's situationally hybrid, where people are coming in when they need to collaborate, but otherwise they're working from home or remotely when they can be flexible or asynchronous. Then you've potentially funded all the retrofit of the office space by downsizing it, and then obviously there's continued returns there year over year as you're not paying for office space you're potentially not using. So I completely agree. And we have a couple customers that have embraced that model, and it allowed them to completely fund new endpoint devices for their staff to be able to be more flexible, hot desking, where you can literally drop your Microsoft Surface tablet in, and the phone adapts itself to your identity, and the office becomes yours for the 2 hours a day you actually need it. But that takes up a lot less space than everybody having a desk that might be used 10% of the time.
Which I think is such a good argument to any organization that argues that maybe they can't afford the virtual or hybrid work environment. We do have a couple questions, so we'll just take these last two and then we'll go ahead and end this. The first one is, what suggestions do you have for enabling hybrid work in places where access to internet connectivity is poor, for example, rural Vermont?
Yeah, I love that question, and Phil's in New Hampshire, so I'm sure he can identify with it some days. But it's interesting. Certainly there are a lot of things changing as it relates to connectivity. I happen to have, extremely fast Fios internet where I am, but I also have customers where, we have a Starlink, where they're testing that out. So, depending on whether you're synchronous or asynchronous, I think the answer can change a bit. If you have to be synchronous with somebody and it might be a video call, absolutely latency plays in, throughput, bandwidth, of course, plays into that equation. But and I mentioned this in my initial, sort of comments, not everything has to be synchronous. Not everything needs to be an hour-long meeting, right? So if you're editing a document and you're just syncing the changes back and forth from the cloud, that requires almost no bandwidth, right? It requires latency is really not an element. And even intermittent connectivity can be managed for, I've gotten work done, from Lake Winnipesaukee on an LTE connection, just about as productively as, sitting here, although my family would probably prefer I wasn't, on my, tablet on vacation. But that said, I think it's a good point. I think, rural broadband, some of the provisions you see in, Build Back Better, for example, or the infrastructure improvements that you see talked about, they benefit everybody. Infrastructure doesn't have to be just roads and bridges. It can be telecom. And certainly things like the propensity and rollout of 4G or 5G, the latency differences associated with that, and then Starlink and other things that I mentioned.
It's a great example. That's where I think, to the question here, is like over the next year, I think a lot of not only from Build Back Better, and that's going to require like that kind of infrastructure might take 2 or 3 years, but over the next year with Starlink and there's even other competitors to SpaceX with Starlink. Starlink is essentially ready now. The testing is going really well. It's extremely low latency and it works well. So there's many situations where I think it could work as a filler.
All right, I'm going to tackle this last question with supply chain issues we have today for receiving hardware used in hybrid work. How do we plan around this?
Oh, this one's a big one for us. Oh, sorry, Phil, go ahead. You want to?
I was going to say plan ahead.
Yeah.
Plan ahead.
And it's so impossible. And we have customers, we get customers that reach out all the time and they're like, we want, 50 Surface devices. And we have to be like, well, how long do you have to wait? It's kind of funny. It used to be that you'd ask, what's your budget? What are your specs? And what are you trying to solve for? And those would be like the 3 main questions. You'd say, here's something that works. And then here's the cost to do it, right? That was the norm when supply chains weren't really a piece of the equation. Now it's what timeline do you need to do it on? And what are the minimum requirements to do it? And then it's like, okay, then we say, we think we can do it for this budget, and we're going to go find a way to make it happen. And it might not be this device, it might be this device, and it's a slight difference in spec, but you're basing it around availability and timeline more so than on spec, knowing that you need to meet some minimum requirements. It has to have a TPM chip in it. It has to be a 13-inch screen, right? Whatever it might be. But no, it's a super interesting question, given, and we have a client, that we work with that deals with supply chain challenges every day. They're, getting product from China, going through ports, Port of Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey, and then having to get it out to schools and businesses and healthcare institutions and things like that. And they're struggling with it too. So it's not just our industry, of course, but plan ahead as much as you can, but be flexible, know what your outcome needs to be, and then be flexible on the way to accomplish it, I would say is my recommendation.
Especially flexible on the budget. Sometimes you might, for your timing, you might need to spend a little more because you might need to get a higher end system because that's the only system that's available at the moment. Yeah. But know that, think again, and all the stuff we've talked about during this webinar, all the long-term benefits that you can capitalize on, and hopefully that extra spend is not going to kill you.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brian. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much to our presenters today. Brian, Jeff, Phil, I really appreciate you for coming on here with me, and I'm sure that all of our guests appreciate you as well. And to our guests, thank you so much for attending our webinar. We really appreciate seeing you here, and I know that I can speak for all of us when we say that we just deeply appreciate having this space and getting to connect with you. For our next webinar, we are going to be diving into an end of the year recap on the biggest trends of 2021 in the tech industry. So that's going to be a really fun one. You don't want to miss it, and we will share more information as it comes. But in the meantime, we do appreciate you so much for coming here, and yeah, we hope that you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.
Bye.
All right, bye.